Most of the Roman losses, such as Cannae, Arausio, Carrhae, and the Teutoburg Forest, were just irregular blips on an otherwise golden record, which failed to cause any permanent degradation of Roman power. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 was a completely different beast, and its disastrous consequences are frequently cited as having directly led to the final fall of Western Rome. Welcome to our video on the late Roman Empire, its Eastern Emperor Valens, and the beginning of the nightmarish clashes with the Goths. Shout out to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. If you haven't heard yet, Magellan TV is an awesome new type of documentary streaming service run by filmmakers that has over 2,000 documentaries worth watching. Recently, we've been watching a documentary series from Magellan TV and would like to recommend it to our viewers. Rome, Empire Without Limit, with the famous historian Mary Beard, answers the question of how a small city, Rome, managed to acquire an empire. Magellan TV has the richest and most varied history content available anywhere: ancient, modern, current, early modern, war, biography, and even non-historical genres like science and crime are historical in nature. We're big fans of Meet the Romans, which is once again presented by famous classicist Mary Beard. You can watch both documentary series anytime, anywhere on your television, laptop or mobile device, and it's compatible with most devices. The best part is Magellan TV is offering a 1-month free membership trial to our viewers. If you haven't signed up to Magellan yet, support our channel and do that at try.magellantv.com/kingsandgenerals. You'll get a 1-month free membership trial. Thanks to Magellan for sponsoring our channel. On November 17th, 375 at Brigetio, near the Roman-Danubian frontier, Senior Augustus Valentinian I was negotiating with emissaries from the Germanic Quedi tribe, whom the empire had been at war with ever since the barbarians raided Pannonia the year before. During the talks, the envoys brazenly declared that because the Romans had constructed a fort on their territory, the raid was justified. Valentinian burst into a red-hot fury, pouring abuse and insults onto the envoys and their tribe, before going quiet and dying from a rage-induced apoplectic fit. Despairing at the youth and possibly weakness of the 16-year-old heir Gratian, who was in Trier at the time, Valentinian's top generals quickly elevated their late sovereign's 4-year-old son, Valentinian II, to the throne as a puppet. Young Gratian, however, quickly proved himself a shrewd politician, establishing de facto control over his half-brother's military backers and gaining supremacy over the entire West. In the east, the late emperor's brother, a 67-year-old Flavius Valens, had been Augustus since 364. Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus describes the Eastern Augustus's character in this manner: he was a faithful and reliable friend, and reprimanded intrigues with severity. He maintained strict discipline in the army and civil service, but was extremely slow to appoint and remove officials, unwilling to endure fatigue although he professed enormous toughness. Following a shaky start to Valens's imperial career, he waged a difficult, hard-fought but ultimately successful campaign against the Goths of Emmaneric from 367 to 369, proving his military mettle. After the barbarians were dealt with, Valens returned to Asia and became locked in yet another years-long dispute with the perennially hostile Sassanid Empire over Armenia. Whilst negotiating to end the war with Persia during the early part of 376, he received a fateful message of cataclysmic events taking place beyond the Danubian frontier. And while Valens was previously content to acquiesce when notified of the accession of Valentinian II, this news was of far greater importance. Shortly after Valens thrashed Emmaneric in the late 360s, the Gothic ruler had a far more serious problem approaching from the east. During the early 370s, the westward migrating Huns crashed like a storm against their fellow nomadic Alani cousins, who were either slain outright or sent barreling west. This Alani remnant desperately smashed into Emmaneric's Grithungi kingdom and, after a brief struggle, defeated it, forcing the Gothic leader to commit suicide. His successor, Vithmir, attempted to fight back by hiring Hunnic mercenaries, but still was overwhelmed and killed in battle. Leadership of the Greuthungi Goths then passed on to Alatheus and Cefrax, who, like a civilizational domino, shepherded their followers across the Dniester River and into the territory of their Western Gothic cousins, the Tervingi. Their king, Athanaric, prepared to resist along with the Greuthungi, but was badly defeated and forced to hide in the mountains when the Huns continued their unstoppable push into Europe. Such rapid success spawned rumours among Germanic tribes and Romans beyond the frontier. The Hunnic expansion was described as such. An unknown race of men appeared from some remote corner of the earth, uprooting and destroying everything in its path like a whirlwind descending from high mountains. Athanaric's authority as king was weakened by his defeats against the Huns, with the consequence that a large number of Tervingi deserted him in favour of two rebel leaders, Fritigern and Alavivus. Aware of the Roman Empire's prosperity, and dreading further conflict with the ferocious Huns, in 376 they led roughly 90,000 Tervingi refugees to the Danube and begged Valens for sanctuary inside Roman borders. Eager to supplement his armies with the Goths, and also well aware that the eastern military was too thinly spread to resist any forced crossing, Valens in Antioch at the time granted the barbarians' request. The Roman commies in Thrace, Lupicinus, and his duke's colleague, Maximus, were given orders to assist the Goths in their passage over the Danube, and then to provide supplies and vacant land. As the Tervingi men, women and children made their way across the Danube, slowly at first but with ever-increasing volume, the situation deteriorated with considerable speed due to a combination of incompetence, malice and sheer scale. The first terrible tragedy was caused by the in-flood river, which drowned many who attempted to make the swim. When luckier Goths reached the shore and began concentrating around the local area in numbers far beyond expectation, Roman logistics in Thrace broke down, and the incoming migrants began starving. Exacerbating the situation were Lupicinus and Maximus, who, rather than moving the Goths on and dispersing them as quickly as possible, notoriously exploited their vulnerability. According to Ammianus Marcellinus, the Goths were forced to sell their children to Roman slave traders in return for rotten dog meat. As Gothic resentment towards their supposed Roman benefactors began to boil, Alatheus, Cefrax and the Greuthungi arrived on the frontier as well, sending Valens their own request for entry. However, at this point realizing that there were neither the provisions nor the manpower in Thrace to deal with any more Goths, the emperor refused. Taking action on behalf of his people, Fritigern forcibly broke out of the containment area and made for a fertile region in the vicinity of Marcianople, where food would hopefully be readily available. In response, the Roman officials had their limited army escort Fritigern's people to the city, where Lupicinus decided on a swift stroke to end the unrest for good. Initially unbeknownst to the Roman forces, the Greuthungi now took their chance and crossed the relatively undefended river by raft. They were under no pretense about what their relationship with the empire was, and quickly embarked on a plundering spree, which Lupicinus was alerted to soon after. At Lupicinus's invitation, Fritigern, Alavivus and their bodyguards were brought into Marcianople for a luxurious banquet, which the Tervingi leaders believed would be the prelude to discussing food provision for their people. Instead, Lupicinus had his soldiers butcher Alavivus and his men, while Fritigern managed to escape. He got out of Marcianople, and with the aid of around 7,000 combat-ready soldiers among the Tervingi refugees, began furiously ravaging the city's hinterland, burning crop fields, looting villas, and destroying farms. Lupicinus marched 9 miles out of the city with 5,000 provincial Limitani troops of his own and met Fritigern in battle. when the Romans came into view of the underfed and ill-equipped Goths, they deployed in their typical defensive infantry formation. Then, in stereotypical barbarian fashion, Fritigern and his warriors launched a vicious headlong charge straight at the Imperial forces, which closed the distance between the two armies in short time. Although our sources for Marcianople are limited, we know that the Tervingi easily got the better of Lupicinus's soldiers at such close quarters. While the Limitane were often unable to even utilize their weapons in the mass melee, Fritigern's individually lethal fighters recklessly but effectively used sword, spear, and shield offensively, overwhelming and killing most of their foes on the field. In the aftermath, the Gothic army was able to re-equip itself with superior Imperial equipment captured from the corpses of Roman legionaries, a fact that would play a role in our story. Among the scattering of survivors was Lupicinus, who galloped back to Marcianople in humiliation. Once he arrived, the commies dispatched messengers to Antioch, informing the eastern-facing Valens what had happened. The Roman situation only became more dire when rumours of this defeat spread. Rather than depleting his ranks, Fritigern's triumphant army swelled with thousands of escaped slaves, Roman prisoners, and Gothic auxilia whose units, despite initially remaining loyal to Rome, turned after the city they were defending threw them out. While at first glance the Tervingi seemed to be riding high, the Goths were only the masters of Thrace's hinterland. They could not take any of the fortified cities and had no proper refuge and no source of supplies. Fritigern could either keep his large army together and have it starve to death, or disperse it and risk the Romans destroying it piecemeal. He chose the latter option, split up his troops, and began foraging throughout the area. Understanding that an emphatic response was necessary, Valens had his Magister Militum, Victor, begin peace negotiations with Persia, while he prepared the elite Eastern Praesental army for its march west. He also sent word to Gratian asking for assistance, and sent two generals, Profuturus and Trajan, to Thrace with a small column of troops. The Western Emperor responded by ordering Frigeridas to march a force of lower quality Limitani troops from Pannonia and Transalpine Gaul into Thrace, while Ricomeres approached from further west with elements of the Gallic Comitatensis. After fighting a guerrilla war against the Goths for most of 377, and confining a significant portion of their foraging bands in the Balkan mountains, Trajan and Profuturus rendezvoused with the western general near a town called Ad Salices in the far northeast, near where the Danube meets the sea. A large concentration of several thousand Goths were nearby, reinforced by new invaders from across the broken frontier, and shielded by a circular fortress of wagons. Ricomeres assumed overall command of the roughly equal Roman force, approached the enemy and prepared to attack when an opportunity arose. One evening, with the Goths unruly due to shortages of food and water, a large band of reinforcements arrived. Eager to get out of their uncomfortable camp, the barbarians vigorously clamoured to be sent at the Romans, but their leaders held them back, probably uneasy at the prospect of a night attack. When the sun rose, however, the numerically superior Goths launched their eager assault, leaving the circle of wagons and dynamically seizing an area of high ground near Ricomeres' army, defensively deployed in a single battle line and small reserve. From this tactically brilliant position, the Goths charged, but halted in javelin range, exchanging missiles with the Romans so fiercely that some unfortunate souls were even impaled to the ground by iron-tipped arrows. As this went on, the line shouted its war cries, banged on their shields, and used other intimidation tactics. After the ranged battle was over, a ferocious close-quarters clash began, both sides engaging in a shielded tortoise formation and suffering significant casualties. After a short time, Ricomeres' left wing routed under Gothic pressure, opening up a vulnerability in the Roman line. However, the Imperial reserves were fed into this section of the line and counterattacked, stabilizing it. battle continued until the sun dipped back beneath the horizon, after which both sides, extremely bloodied, returned to camp. Although Ammianus states that the Romans inflicted severe distress on the barbarian host, Ricomeres' army, the only functional imperial force in Thrace, was no longer capable of fighting. It was a Gothic strategic victory. In the aftermath, Ricomeres returned to Gaul with the task of raising more men, leaving Frigeridus to fortify a strong mountain bottleneck at Beroea between Illyricum and the central Balkans. At the same time, the eastern leaders were replaced by Valens' master of horse, Saturninus, who assisted in keeping the Goths bottled up in inhospitable terrain. By the end of 377, the Goths still hadn't been dislodged from Thrace, and it was increasingly clear that no half measures would be significant enough to expel them. So, while Valens began pulling as many troops away from the Armenian frontier as possible, Gratian started marching east from Gaul in concert, set on catching the Goths in a pre-planned pincer. Unfortunately, during that winter, it is said that an Alemannic Roman auxiliary went back home across the Rhine, revealing that Gratian was going east. This prompted his tribe, the Latienses, to launch a series of raids across the frozen river in February 378. Although these smaller attacks were easily deflected by some of the Emperor's Auxilia Palatina, they were actually just a scouting force learning if Gratian really had left. When the raiders returned with news that the Western Emperor's armies were in Illyricum, the Latienses crossed the Rhine near Agantaria and invaded the empire again, this time with considerable numbers. Gratian was alerted to this attack and marched back from Illyricum, raised more Gallic troops, and crushed the barbarians in a brilliant campaign. However swift and well executed this defense of the Western Empire had been, it disrupted all of the preparations Gratian had been making to aid Valens, drastically reduced the amount of troops he was willing to bring, and delayed the intervention by crucial months. On the other side of the Roman Empire, Valens, with the Persian situation relatively stable for the time being, brought most of his formidable army from Antioch to Constantinople. On arrival, he was forced to quell unrest which had been caused by religious divisions, the terrible state of the Balkans, and fear of just how close the Goths were. Then he moved his armies to Melanthius, 20 kilometers from the eastern capital, making it his operational base. While Valens marshaled his strength and prepared the army for a grand campaign in 378, he appointed a newly arrived western general called Sebastian as Magister Militum to replace his commanders in the conflict zone and continue waging the guerrilla war. The new Magister was far more effective than his predecessors, rapidly eliminating many small parties of Fritigern's Goths in the vicinity of Adrianople, and all but clearing the area in preparation for his sovereign's advance. News of these reverses and the incoming two-pronged attack reached Fritigern, convincing him to reconcentrate all his warriors near Cabalae. Realizing what was happening, Valens marched from Melanthius towards Adrianople with a 15,000 to 20,000 strong force, comprising much of the veteran praesental army of the east, with a core of the Emperor's elite Scolae units. Beyond the great city named by Hadrian 250 years earlier, Valens would follow the Maritsa west until he met Gratian coming the other way. Unfortunately for the prospects of this neat plan, Fritigern and his roughly 10,000 hardened Gothic warriors acted first, striking rapidly down the Tunza valley towards Adrianople as well. According to his plan, Fritigern approached the urban centre after Valens had already passed by, threatening the Emperor's supply lines back to Constantinople. Roman scouts quickly detected the Gothic leader's main force, prompting the Emperor to pivot and march back towards Adrianople. However, the Outriders failed to spot several other significant enemy forces in the nearby vicinity, such as Alathius and Saphrax's Grithungi, and a small contingent of Alani nomads. Valens convened a war council to decide on the course that the campaign would take. wait for Gratian, or fight now. Some officers, such as Sebastian, urged their emperor to take the field immediately, likely arguing that Gratian's force was now not even worth waiting for, especially if on arrival they would receive some of the glory. Others, such as Victor, were more prudent and cautious, urging Valens to wait for any reinforcements he could get. This latter perspective was bolstered by the newly arrived Ricomeres, who came to Valens in advance of the Western Emperor's force. He beseeched the Eastern Augustus to wait a short time until Gratian arrived to share the danger and not rashly commit himself to the risks of a decisive action single-handed. In the end, convinced by flattery and arrogance, Valens chose to fight a battle alone, which, in his opinion, was already won. After dismissing a number of Gothic peace overtures, Valens strode from Adrianople at the head of the Imperial army on August 9, 378, marching north in the sweltering heat of midsummer through incredibly rough terrain. After a difficult 8-mile trek, Rome's legions caught sight of Fritigern and his people atop a high ridge near modern Muratcali. With their vanguard of right-wing cavalry forming a protective screen for the infantry behind, Valens' army began deploying for battle at 2 p.m. Eager to play for time so that his Greuthungi and Alan allies, unknown to the Romans at the time, could make their appearance, Fritigern delayed the Eastern Augustus with faux peace negotiations, which he may have accepted upon observation of the superior Gothic battlefield position or their higher-than-expected numbers. Talks between the two sides went back and forth, with no sign of a conclusion, stalled by protocol and fine print details. The Romans first rejected the Gothic envoys outright, as they were not high enough in rank, but were subsequently tempted once again when Fritigern offered to speak with them in person, if equivalent hostages were provided. This intended farce of statecraft went on for some hours, during which time the Roman troops stood exposed to terrible heat, possibly rising beyond 40 degrees Celsius, sweating and uncomfortable in their heavy metal armor, dry-throated and crippled by hunger. Eventually, Ricomeres offered himself up as a high-status hostage, but before he could leave, it was already too late. A haughty unit of Valens' elite Scole-mounted archers on the extreme left wing, known as the Scutarii, were probing around the ridge near Fritigern's flank opposite them when the Gothic right charged. These Roman skirmishers were knocked totally off balance and overwhelmed by a superior force, sending them into retreat. As Ammianus makes clear, their retreat was as cowardly as their advance had been rash. At that very moment, about 10,000 mounted Greuthungi and Alan cavalry galloped onto the battlefield, sweeping the Scutarii and their attached units away. Seeing this, and realizing his great opportunity had finally arrived, Fritigern had his Tervingi advance downhill across the entire front at a Roman army which still wasn't fully deployed. As a standard infantry slog began in the center, the bulk of the Roman left flank cavalry launched their attack. While the forward units on this side broke through and managed to penetrate as far as the Goths' Wagenlager, others behind panicked upon seeing the retreating Scole and followed them in flight. The consequent weakness led to the remainder of the Roman mounted troops on the left being utterly destroyed. This disaster left Valens' infantry completely vulnerable to a massive Greuthungi Alan cavalry strike, which immediately began splintering their outflanked ranks, pressing the Imperial soldiers together so that it was impossible to see the enemy's missiles in flight and dodge them. All found their mark and dealt death on every side. Faced with utter encirclement and a terrible death, many units who could retreated from the battlefield, but not the Empire's most senior Auxilia Palatina. Two of them, the Lanciarii and Matiarii, held firm amidst the advancing barbarians and a tide of their own routing comrades, allowing Valens, who had been abandoned by his bodyguard, to take refuge amongst them. From there he ordered Victor, on the unengaged Roman right, to bring up the Batavi reserves, but they had already left the field. The emperor's top generals, including Victor, Saturninus and Ricomeres, did the same thing, leaving Valens to his fate. In the final moments of the battle, with the corpses of elite palace warriors all around him, the Eastern Augustus was struck by an arrow. Some sources state that Valens died then and there from his wounds, while others relate how the emperor was taken to a nearby fortified farmhouse by his remaining companions as night fell. The victorious Goths were initially repelled from the structure, but retaliated by burning the entire thing down, unwittingly killing Valens in the process. Up to 2/3 of the Roman army of the East died at Adrianople, if Ammianus is to be believed. Even if this figure is slightly exaggerated, the horror on show is best described by the man himself, who states that the roads were blocked by many who lay mortally wounded, lamenting the torment of their wounds, and with them also mounds of fallen horses filled the plains with corpses. To these ever irreparable losses, so costly to the Roman state, a night without the bright light of the moon put an end. The empire's worst nightmare had finally come true. A barbarian people had battered its way into its lands, and although the Romans would resolve the situation in the forthcoming years, they would never fully recover. The beginning of the end had come. It might be the end of one story, but our videos on the Roman Empire will continue with the story of the Battle of Frigidus, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now, you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.